In this section, we'll look at the causes of the Great Depression. If you ask the average person what caused the Great Depression, they're liable to say the stock market crash of October 1929. While that stock market crash was certainly an important part of the Great Depression, it was not the sole reason for the Great Depression. It was more like a precipitating event. It set into motion a number of factors in the economy that were not apparent during the 1920s boom, but were sort of ready to explode. If you look at the stock market in the late 1920s, there was a speculative bubble. Stocks really shot up in the late 1920s, but a lot of people didn't really know what they were doing, and it was a disaster waiting to happen. A lot of investors were ignorant of companies. There was a lot of fraud, and as I say, it was just getting ready to explode. For much of 1929, Americans just seemed to ignore what evidence of problems existed. Individual debt was growing, especially, as I said, buying on margin by people. And there was an actual slowdown in the automobile and construction industries in the early fall of 1929. And more worrisome, in September 1929, there was a crash on the London stock market, any one of which should have scared people, but Americans just kept on buying. Eventually, of course, the weights on the economy would be reflected in the stock market, New York Stock Exchange. On October 24th, Black Thursday, the market actually lost 11% of its value at the very opening bell on very heavy trading. And the huge volume meant that the report of prices on the ticker tape in brokerage offices around the nation was hours late. So investors had no idea what most stocks were actually trading for at that moment, which of course just increased panic. A number of leading bankers, including J.P. Morgan, decided that they would pool their money, sort of the consortium, and buy up a bunch of stocks, hopefully calming the markets. And indeed, on Friday, October 25th, the markets were sort of calmed down a bit. And then on the weekend, there was no trading. On Monday, October 28th, the investors continued to pull their money out of the stock, but with the bankers sort of stabilizing the market, there wasn't too much of a loss. The following day, however, October 29th, 1929, forever known as Black Tuesday, you're going to see that even the bankers' money can't stock up the market anymore. Even the Rockefeller family tries to buy up more stock and to stabilize the market, but nothing would work on this day. About 16 million shares traded as panic selling sort of reached its crescendo. Some stocks actually had no buyers at all that day. And what we're going to see is the volume of stocks traded on October 29, 1929 was a record not broken for almost 40 years. It was a low point in the stock market for the nation. Hearing of the tumble, crowds began to form on the steps of the New York Stock Exchange, no one sure of what was going to happen next. Police were called. It is, however, an urban myth that stockbrokers took the elevators to the roof and jumped off. Nevertheless, it was clear that a panic had set in much larger than the simply selling and buying of stocks. Having lost their money in the stock market, people were worried about their money in the bank, so everybody went to the bank in a classic panic. And when the banks couldn't meet all the demand for the cash, they went bankrupt, and that meant that people had lost not only their money in the stock market, but they lost their money in the bank. Well, hey, at least they still had a paycheck. Now, what they did, however, is they had lost a lot of money and they have a paycheck. They're not going to go out and do a lot of spending. They're going to save what cash they can get. And of course, everybody is doing that. Everybody's spending is going to go down, and that is going to eventually hurt businesses who are going to begin to lay off workers. It's going to begin to drive employment up. Ultimately, it's this psychology of fear that drives the depression. It's the engine of the faltering economy. When Roosevelt came in office in 1933, he famously said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." It's this psychology he was referring to. People, if they don't spend, then unemployment's going to go up and the economy will suffer. While that is the essential engine of the Great Depression, there are other factors in the economy that weren't apparent during the 1920s, but in retrospect helped contribute to the falling economy. For example, there was too much concentration of wealth in the 1920s. The number of rich was getting richer and the number of poor was getting poorer. The aggregate economy was growing, but it was increasingly centered in the wealthy. Now, what that meant was that while the wealthy could buy everything they wanted, they really didn't have a need for a lot of products. They could buy fabulous products, but they wouldn't buy a lot of them. And that meant that eventually consumption would go down. There wouldn't be as need for as many jobs making these products. And so that contributed to the faltering economy. Moreover, a healthy economy has a lot of people employed in a lot of different industries, so that if one industry goes bad, it won't disproportionately send a lot of people into unemployment. Looking back, in retrospect, in the 1920s economy, a lot of people were employed, but they were too dependent upon the automobile and construction industry. And as I've already said, when these industries began to falter, it really put a lot of people out of work too soon. A weak farm economy also contributed to the Great Depression. Farmers were still producing too much, driving prices for their crops down, and so they had no money in the bank. And when the economy went bad, the entire agricultural economy went down quickly without any reserves. Of course, the international economy was also contributing to the spread of the Great Depression. When everybody stormed the banks asking for their money in 1929, of course the United States banks would no longer lend money to the government of Germany like they had promised in the Dawes Plan. And without that money coming in, Germany would then default on its reparation payments from World War I to Britain and France. And without the reparation payments coming from Germany, Britain and France in time would default on repaying their loans they'd borrowed to win the war from World War I in the first place. And so the United States wouldn't have those loans coming back in. The Great Depression would in that way spread internationally. With the Great Depression having spread internationally, what most economies did, the United States included, was they began to put up high tariffs, sort of a protectionist international policy. They wanted their own consumption, to the extent that people were buying, to buy their own nation's products. That way there'd be more jobs making those products in that country. The problem was that most economists looking back believed that the world economy got into the Depression together, and that it needed to get out together. And you're going to see almost an end, a slowdown, tremendous slowdown in international trade that most economists think would have helped all countries recover from the Great Depression. If you're looking at the causes, you might want to look to the Federal Reserve. When the unemployment rate goes up, most people expect the Federal Reserve to lower the interest rate it charged private banks to borrow from them, and that way it would flood the economy with money and give banks an easy access to cash when they desperately need it. The Federal Reserve at the time, however, didn't do that. They were too worried about devaluating the dollar. They're too worried about inflation, and they kept the interest rate they charged private banks very, very high. And so what ends up happening is banks couldn't afford to borrow the money right when they needed it, and that also contributed to the Great Depression. Lastly, we have to look at the incumbent president's actions, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a Republican, and he didn't have a great belief in the federal action, and so his actions that he takes are going to be insufficient to the crisis. And we'll discuss Herbert Hoover's reactions in a later section. But overall, his inability to move certainly allowed the Great Depression to grow. This concludes the section on the causes of the Great Depression.